Karoline Leavitt wasn't your typical political insider. At just 28 years old, she had already made a name for herself in Washington, D.C., a place where most people her age were still figuring out their careers. She worked as the communications director for a well-known but polarizing politician on Capitol Hill. Her job was to handle media inquiries, manage public messaging, and navigate the stormy waters of national news cycles. But Karoline wasn't just another cog in the machine. What set her apart was her sharp mind, her ability to think several steps ahead, and her relentless curiosity about how power really worked. From the moment she stepped into politics, Karoline realized something important. Not everything happened in plain sight. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made that shaped lives, decisions no one outside those rooms ever heard about. This realization gnawed at her. Was it fair? Was it right? Over time, she began to wonder if there was a way to shine a light on what went on behind the scenes. That's when an idea started forming in her head, an idea that would eventually change everything. At first, it seemed harmless enough. During meetings with lawmakers, lobbyists, and other key players, Karoline started recording conversations. She told herself it was for documentation purposes, a way to ensure accuracy when drafting statements or preparing talking points. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She wanted proof, not just for herself, but for anyone who cared enough to listen. Over months, Karoline built up a collection of recordings. Some were mundane, capturing routine discussions about policy proposals or press releases. Others, however, revealed something darker: secret deals, backroom negotiations, and even attempts to manipulate the media. The more she listened, the clearer it became that these recordings weren't just interesting, they were explosive. They exposed cracks in the system, showing how power often flowed not through transparency and fairness, but through compromise and convenience. Despite knowing the potential consequences, Karoline couldn't stop. Each new recording felt like another piece of a puzzle coming together. She knew releasing them could make her a target, but she also believed the truth mattered more than her personal safety. Still, she kept her plan close to her chest, trusting only a handful of people with what she was doing. For now, she played the role everyone expected: the diligent, hard-working communications director. Meanwhile, across the country, Maddow was gearing up for another episode of her popular nightly show. Known for her calm, measured delivery and deep dives into complex issues, Rachel had become a household name over the years. Her show wasn't just entertainment, it was a platform for holding powerful people accountable. Every night, millions tuned in to hear her break down the day's biggest stories, offering insights that others missed. But this particular evening would turn out differently from any other. Unbeknownst to Rachel, Karoline Leavitt had accepted an invitation to appear on the show. On paper, it looked like a standard interview, a chance to discuss recent developments in Congress and maybe offer some insider perspective. What Rachel didn't know, however, was that Karoline wasn't planning to stick to the script. Instead, she was bringing something extraordinary with her: the secret recordings. As the clock ticked closer to airtime, neither woman fully grasped how much this encounter would alter their lives. For Karoline, it was the culmination of months of careful planning and quiet determination. For Rachel, it was about to become one of the most unforgettable moments of her career. Neither of them could have predicted the chain of events that was about to unfold, or the laughter that would echo across living rooms nationwide. Little did they know, this meeting between two strong-willed individuals, one armed with secrets, the other armed with questions, would spark a conversation that would ripple far beyond the confines of a TV studio. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about trust, accountability, and the lengths people go to uncover the truth. And as the cameras rolled that night, the world watched, unaware that history was about to be made. The stage was set. Rachel Maddow sat behind her desk, the familiar backdrop of books and papers neatly arranged behind her. Her demeanor was calm, collected, and professional, as always. The opening monologue had gone smoothly. She'd laid out the day's top stories with her trademark clarity and depth. Now it was time for the guest segment, and Karoline Leavitt was ready to take her seat. Karoline walked onto the set with a quiet confidence that masked the storm brewing inside. She greeted Rachel warmly, exchanging pleasantries before settling into the chair across from the host. To anyone watching, it looked like just another routine interview. But Karoline knew better. She carried with her a small USB drive tucked safely in her pocket, a tiny object holding explosive content that could shake the foundations of American politics. As the cameras rolled, Rachel leaned forward slightly, her expression attentive but neutral. "Thanks for joining us tonight," she said, her voice steady and inviting. "You've been at the center of some pretty big developments on Capitol Hill lately. Let's dive in." Karoline nodded, smiling politely. For the first few minutes, the conversation unfolded exactly as expected. Rachel asked thoughtful questions about recent legislative battles, campaign strategies, and the challenges of working in such a high-pressure environment. Karoline answered confidently, offering insightful commentary without giving too much away. It was all very normal, or so it seemed. But then, something shifted. Midway through the interview, Karoline paused briefly after answering a question. She glanced down at her lap, took a deep breath, and looked directly at Rachel. There was a flicker of determination in her eyes, a subtle signal that she was about to pivot. "Rachel," she began, her tone measured but firm, "there's something I think viewers need to hear. Something bigger than what we've been talking about so far." Rachel tilted her head slightly, intrigued but cautious. "Oh? And what might that be?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. She had no idea what was coming next. Karoline reached into her pocket, pulled out the USB drive, and held it up for the camera to see. "This," she said simply, "contains recordings. Secret ones. Conversations between politicians, lobbyists, and journalists. Conversations that reveal how decisions are really made in this country." The room froze. Even the crew off camera seemed to hold their breath. Rachel's eyebrows shot up, her composed exterior momentarily cracking. Wait, she said, leaning back in her chair. "Are you saying you have audio evidence of private discussions?" "Yes," Karoline replied, her voice unwavering. "And I'm prepared to share some of it right now." Without waiting for permission, Karoline opened her laptop, connected it to the studio's audio system, and queued up the first recording. As the sound filled the room, everyone, including Rachel, was forced to listen. What followed was a series of clips that painted a damning picture of corruption, compromise, and collusion. The first recording featured a prominent senator casually dismissing concerns about campaign finance reform during a private dinner with a wealthy donor. "We'll give them enough lip service to keep the watchdogs happy," the senator said with a chuckle. "But let's be real, money talks, and we're here to listen." Next came a clip of a senior journalist admitting they had deliberately softened coverage of a scandal involving one of their network's major advertisers. "We can't afford to lose them," the journalist said bluntly. "Sometimes you have to pick your battles." Each revelation hit like a punch to the gut, leaving Rachel visibly stunned. Her usual razor-sharp composure faltered as she struggled to process what she was hearing. "These are serious allegations," she stammered, glancing at Karoline. "Do you understand the implications of releasing this kind of material?" "I do," Karoline responded firmly. "And I believe the public deserves to know the truth. These recordings expose a side of our political system that most people never get to see. If we want real change, we can't keep pretending these things don't happen." Rachel tried to regain control of the situation, peppering Karoline with questions about the authenticity of the recordings and the ethics of obtaining them. But Karoline remained unfazed, calmly defending her actions and emphasizing the importance of transparency. The tension in the room was palpable, and viewers at home could feel it too. What started as a routine interview had spiraled into something entirely unexpected. Rachel, normally the one steering the conversation, found herself on the defensive. Meanwhile, Karoline continued to push forward, determined to ensure that her message and the recordings were heard loud and clear. By the time the segment ended, both women were visibly shaken. The audience, however, was electrified. Social media lit up almost instantly, with hashtags trending and memes flooding timelines. No one could have predicted how this evening would unfold, or the ripple effects it would create in the days to come. For Rachel, the challenge was far from over. She prided herself on being a seeker of truth, yet here she was, blindsided by someone who had dared to expose truths she hadn't uncovered herself. For Karoline, the battle was only beginning. She had ignited a firestorm and there was no turning back now. As the first recording ended, the studio fell eerily silent. For a moment it felt like time stood still. Rachel stared at Karoline, her sharp eyes wide with disbelief. Her usual calm and composed demeanor was starting to crack, replaced by something raw and unguarded. The audience watching from home could feel the tension thickening in the air. No one knew what would come next, but everyone sensed that this was no ordinary interview. Karoline didn't hesitate. She pressed play again, and another clip began, a senior journalist admitting they had softened coverage of a scandal involving one of their network's biggest advertisers. "If we push too hard, they'll pull their funding," the voice on the recording said matter-of-factly. "And then where would we be?" The words hung heavy in the room. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just an attack on politicians or lobbyists. It was a direct challenge to the media itself, including her own profession. Every new clip seemed to cut deeper, exposing layers of compromise and collusion that most people assumed only happened in movies or conspiracy theories. Rachel tried to regain control of the conversation. "Okay, hold on," she interjected, raising a hand as if to physically stop the momentum. "Let's take a step back here. These recordings are explosive, yes. But how do we know they're authentic? And more importantly, how did you get them?" Karoline leaned forward, her expression unwavering. "I recorded them myself," she said simply. "Over months, I attended meetings, fundraisers, and private events, sometimes posing as a staffer, sometimes blending into the background. I did whatever it took to document what happens when the cameras aren't rolling." Her tone was steady, almost clinical, but there was a fire behind her words. She wasn't apologizing for what she'd done. She was owning it. "I knew the risks," she added. "But I also knew that someone had to shine a light on this. If we don't talk about these things openly, nothing will ever change." Rachel blinked rapidly, trying to process everything. She was caught between two instincts. The journalist in her wanted to dig deeper, to ask follow-up questions and demand answers. But the human in her, the woman sitting across from someone who had just dropped a bombshell live on national television, was struggling to keep up. That's when it happened. As Karoline described the lengths she'd gone to gather the recordings, how she'd risked her career, her reputation, and even her safety, Rachel let out a laugh. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle. It was a full-blown crack-up, complete with tears streaming down her face. For a split second, the absurdity of the situation hit her. Here she was, the host of a show dedicated to uncovering truths, being blindsided by someone who had taken truth-seeking to an entirely different level. It was ironic, surreal, and maybe even a little funny, if you looked at it from the right angle. But the laughter didn't last long. As quickly as it came, Rachel caught herself wiping her eyes and clearing her throat. "Sorry," she muttered, shaking her head. "It's just, wow, this is insane." Karoline raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by Rachel's reaction. "Insane?" she echoed. "Or just honest?" The comment hit its mark. Rachel sat up straighter, regaining some of her composure. "Look," she said, her voice firmer now. "I'm not saying this isn't important, but you have to understand the gravity of what you've done. Secret recordings? That's a huge ethical gray area. You're going to face blowback for this, probably a lot of it." "I know," Karoline replied without missing a beat. "And I'm ready for it, because at the end of the day, the truth matters more than my comfort, doesn't it?" Rachel opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was no easy answer to that question. On one hand, Karoline's actions were undeniably provocative, even controversial. On the other hand, the recordings spoke for themselves, revealing truths that couldn't be ignored. The rest of the interview passed in a blur. Rachel asked pointed questions, trying to dissect Karoline's motives and methods. Karoline answered candidly, never backing down from her stance. By the time the segment wrapped up, both women looked exhausted but also exhilarated. They had just had a conversation that would ripple far beyond the confines of the TV studio. Backstage after the taping, the energy was electric. Producers and crew members buzzed with excitement, replaying key moments from the interview. Social media was already ablaze, with clips of Rachel's uncontrollable laughter spreading like wildfire. Viewers were divided. Some praised Karoline for her bravery, calling her a whistleblower and a hero. Others criticized her tactics, accusing her of crossing ethical lines. Meanwhile, Rachel retreated to her dressing room, replaying the interview in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been outmaneuvered, not because Karoline had tricked her, but because she had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths. Truths about the system, about the media, and perhaps even about herself. For Karoline, the aftermath was equally intense. As she left the studio, her phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. Messages poured in from supporters and detractors alike. Some thanked her for exposing corruption. Others accused her of betraying trust. But through it all, she remained resolute. She had known this moment would come with consequences, and she was prepared to face them head-on. What neither woman realized at the time was that this was just the beginning. The interview had set off a chain reaction, sparking debates about ethics, accountability, and the role of journalism in holding power to account. In the days and weeks to come, both Rachel and Karoline would find themselves navigating uncharted territory, forced to grapple with the fallout of what had transpired on live television. For now, though, the world watched and waited, eager to see what would happen next. One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The moment the interview ended, the internet exploded. Within minutes, clips of Rachel's uncontrollable laughter went viral. Memes flooded social media feeds, some mocking her reaction, others celebrating it as a rare glimpse of humanity from a usually unflappable host. Hashtags like Maddow laughs and secret recordings started trending worldwide. People couldn't stop talking about what they had just witnessed. For Karoline, the spotlight was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Her phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers reached out to congratulate her or criticize her for exposing the truth. Some called her courageous, hailing her as a modern-day whistleblower, willing to risk everything for transparency. Others accused her of overstepping ethical boundaries, arguing that secret recordings undermined trust and fairness. The divide in public opinion was sharp, and Karoline found herself at the center of a heated national debate. Meanwhile, Rachel faced her own challenges. As a respected journalist, known for holding powerful people accountable, she suddenly found herself on shaky ground. Critics pounced on her reaction during the interview, accusing her of losing composure and failing to maintain professionalism. Clips of her laughing were replayed endlessly, often accompanied by snarky captions. Some viewers felt betrayed, wondering if her response meant she was complicit in covering up the very issues Karoline had exposed. Others defended her, pointing out that anyone would be caught off guard by such a bold move. Behind the scenes, Rachel wrestled with mixed emotions. On one hand, she admired Karoline's determination to bring hidden truths to light. She believed in the importance of investigative journalism and understood why someone might feel compelled to take drastic measures. But on the other hand, she struggled with the ethics of using secret recordings to make a point. Was it right to deceive people in order to expose deception? Where did accountability end and exploitation begin? Rachel decided to address the controversy head-on. In the days following the interview, she dedicated an entire episode of her show to dissecting the implications of Karoline's actions. Sitting behind her desk, she spoke candidly to her audience. What happened last week was unexpected, she admitted, choosing her words carefully. I'll be honest, I wasn't prepared for the magnitude of what Karoline revealed. And yes, I laughed. It wasn't because I thought it was funny. It was because, for a brief moment, I saw the absurdity of it all. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. But let's be clear, the content of those recordings is serious. They raise important questions about how decisions are made in our political system and how we, as journalists, report on them. So while I may not agree with every method used to obtain these tapes, I can't ignore their significance. Her remarks struck a chord with viewers. Many appreciated her willingness to acknowledge her initial reaction and engage with the larger issues at play. For the first time in years, Rachel appeared vulnerable, not as a polished TV personality, but as a human being grappling with complex moral dilemmas. This newfound authenticity resonated deeply with her audience, earning her renewed respect. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout continued to unfold. Lawmakers scrambled to distance themselves from the individuals implicated in the recordings. Senators denied allegations of corruption, lobbyists issued vague statements defending their work, and journalists launched internal investigations into their own practices. The ripple effect reached far beyond the studio where the interview had taken place. Karoline, too, faced intense scrutiny. Anonymous threats poured in, forcing her to hire security for protection. Yet despite the backlash, she refused to back down. She gave interviews to other outlets, explaining her motivations and urging people to focus on the bigger picture. "This isn't about me," she insisted repeatedly. "It's about shining a light on systemic problems. If we don't talk about these things openly, nothing will ever change." Her persistence paid off. Slowly but surely, public opinion began to shift. While some still condemned her methods, many came to see her as a catalyst for change, a voice demanding accountability in a world that often seemed rigged against ordinary citizens. Grassroots movements sprang up online, with activists calling for greater transparency in government and media. Even mainstream news organizations, initially hesitant to touch the story, started digging deeper into the issues raised by Karoline's recordings. For Rachel, the experience proved humbling, yet transformative. She realized that no matter how much she thought she knew about politics and power, there was always more to uncover. Instead of seeing Karoline as an adversary, she began to view her as a kindred spirit, a fellow seeker of truth navigating a complicated landscape. This shift in perspective laid the groundwork for something neither woman anticipated, a chance to collaborate rather than clash. In the meantime, life moved forward for both of them. Karoline returned to her day-to-day responsibilities, though, now under the watchful eyes of critics and supporters alike. She remained steadfast in her mission, determined to keep pushing for reform. Rachel, meanwhile, channeled her energy into producing hard-hitting segments inspired by the revelations. Her show became a platform for exploring the broader implications of Karoline's recordings, sparking conversations that extended far beyond the confines of cable television. Yet beneath the surface, tensions lingered. Both women were aware that their paths had crossed in a way that would forever shape their careers, and perhaps their lives. What started as a confrontation had evolved into something more nuanced, a shared recognition of the complexities involved in seeking justice and truth. Neither of them could have predicted where this journey would lead next, but one thing was certain. The events of that fateful evening had changed them both in ways they were only beginning to understand. Weeks turned into months and the dust began to settle, but the impact of that explosive interview continued to reverberate. For Karoline, life had become a whirlwind of attention, opportunities, and challenges. She was no longer just a communications director. She was now a public figure thrust into the national spotlight. Her days were filled with speaking engagements, media appearances, and meetings with activists who wanted to collaborate on campaigns for transparency and accountability. At first, the constant scrutiny took its toll. Karoline found herself second-guessing every decision, wondering if she'd gone too far or not far enough. The threats hadn't stopped. They came in waves, often late at night when she least expected them. Some were vague warnings, others more direct, but all carried the same message: back down or else. Yet despite the fear, Karoline refused to let it silence her. If anything, the intimidation only strengthened her resolve. She reminded herself why she'd started this journey in the first place, to expose the truth and inspire change. Her memoir hit bookshelves within 6 months of the interview, chronicling her experiences from the inside world of politics to the moment she decided to record those secret conversations. The book became an instant bestseller, praised for its raw honesty and unflinching look at the darker corners of power. Readers connected with her story, not because they agreed with everything she did, but because they saw themselves in her struggle to do what she believed was right, even when it meant standing alone. Karoline's speaking tour brought her face to face with people across the country, ordinary citizens who felt disillusioned by the system and inspired by her courage. At each stop, she shared her story, urging audiences to demand better from their leaders and hold institutions accountable. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she often said during Q&A sessions, "but it starts with asking questions and refusing to accept empty answers." For Rachel, the aftermath was equally transformative. While some critics still mocked her reaction during the infamous interview, many viewers came to appreciate her vulnerability as a sign of authenticity. In the weeks following the broadcast, her show reached record ratings, driven by a renewed interest in investigative journalism. Viewers tuned in not just for breaking news, but for deeper dives into the issues raised by Karoline's recordings. Rachel threw herself into these investigations with renewed vigor. She assembled a team dedicated to exploring the systemic problems exposed by the tapes, everything from campaign finance loopholes to media ethics. Each episode felt like a step toward redemption, not just for Rachel personally, but for journalism as a whole. She understood now that being a seeker of truth wasn't about always having the upper hand. It was about staying curious, humble, and willing to learn, even when the lessons were uncomfortable. One evening, after wrapping up another intense day of filming, Rachel sat alone in her office, staring at a photo on her desk. It was taken years ago, early in her career, when she'd first dreamed of using television as a tool for exposing corruption. Back then, she'd been idealistic, convinced that the truth would set everyone free. Over time, however, the grind of deadlines, ratings pressures, and political pushback had worn her down. That spark of optimism had dimmed, but now, thanks to Karoline, it was flickering back to life. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. Rachel and Karoline began crossing paths again, not in heated debates or confrontational interviews, but in quieter, more meaningful ways. They were invited to the same panel discussions about media ethics and government accountability. At first, their interactions were polite but distant. Both women were wary of revisiting the tension of their initial encounter. But over time, they found common ground. Conversations that started as professional exchanges gradually evolved into genuine dialogue. During one such event, a town hall, hosted by a nonprofit focused on civic engagement, the two women ended up sitting side by side on stage. When asked about their thoughts on restoring trust in institutions, Rachel turned to Karoline and said, "You know, I used to think I had all the answers. Then you walked into my studio and reminded me that sometimes the hardest truths come from the most unlikely places." The audience erupted in applause, sensing the weight of the moment. Karoline smiled, nodding slightly. "And you reminded me," she replied, "that even the strongest voices can falter when faced with uncomfortable realities. Maybe that's where real progress begins, not with perfection, but with honesty." Their exchange marked a turning point. What had once been a contentious relationship transformed into mutual respect. Neither woman claimed to have all the solutions, but both recognized the value of working together toward a shared goal, creating a world where transparency and accountability weren't optional, but expected. In the months that followed, Rachel invited Karoline back onto her show, not as an adversary, but as a guest collaborator. This time, the conversation was different. There were no secret recordings, no ambushes, no moments of shock. Instead, they engaged in a thoughtful discussion about how ordinary citizens could participate in shaping a fairer society. Viewers responded positively, appreciating the shift from conflict to cooperation. Behind the scenes, the two women worked closely to ensure the segment resonated authentically. They rehearsed key talking points, debated potential counter-arguments, and even laughed about the absurdity of their earlier clash. It was clear that their bond had deepened, forged through adversity and a shared commitment to making a difference. By the time the episode aired, it felt less like a TV show and more like a conversation between two people who had grown wiser through their experiences. For Rachel, it was a chance to demonstrate growth, to show her audience that she wasn't afraid to admit when she'd been wrong. For Karoline, it was validation that her efforts had sparked meaningful change, inspiring others to join the fight for justice. As the credits rolled, Rachel leaned back in her chair, smiling faintly. "Well," she said to the camera, "that was different, and maybe exactly what we needed." Karoline nodded, returning the smile. "Different is good," she said softly. "Sometimes it's the only way forward." Neither woman knew what the future held, but they were okay with that. They had learned that progress wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking the right questions and staying open to wherever the journey might lead. Months turned into a year, and the world moved on. But not completely. The echoes of that explosive interview lingered in ways no one could have predicted. For Karoline and Rachel, the journey had transformed them both personally and professionally. What started as a clash between two strong-willed individuals had evolved into something far greater, a shared mission to challenge the status quo and demand accountability from those in power. Karoline's life was unrecognizable compared to what it had been before. She'd left her role as a communications director, trading late-night meetings, on Capitol Hill for a new purpose, advocacy work. She founded an organization dedicated to promoting transparency in government and media, using her story to inspire others to speak up. Her speaking tour expanded globally, taking her to countries where corruption ran rampant and citizens yearned for change. Everywhere she went, people approached her after events, sharing their own frustrations and asking how they could make a difference. One evening, while packing up her materials after a talk in Chicago, Karoline overheard a young woman in the crowd say to her friend, "If she can do it, why can't we?" And those words stayed with her long after the event ended. It wasn't just about exposing secrets anymore. It was about empowering ordinary people to believe they had the power to create change. That realization became the cornerstone of everything Karoline did moving forward. Back home, Rachel continued to build on the momentum sparked by the interview. Her show remained popular, but its tone shifted subtly. Gone were the days of simply reporting scandals or dissecting political maneuvers. Now, each episode felt like a call to action, a reminder that journalism wasn't just about telling stories, but inspiring audiences to engage with the issues affecting their lives. Viewers noticed the difference. Ratings climbed, not because of sensationalism, but because of substance. Rachel also took steps outside her comfort zone. She began mentoring young journalists, encouraging them to dig deeper and ask tougher questions. "The truth isn't always easy to find," she told them during workshops, "and sometimes it comes from places you least expect." She made sure never to mention Karoline directly, but everyone knew who she was referring to. The lesson stuck. Even the most seasoned reporters could learn from unexpected sources. Despite their busy schedules, Karoline and Rachel stayed in touch. Their relationship had grown beyond mutual respect. It was now rooted in genuine friendship. They met occasionally for coffee or dinner, catching up on life and swapping ideas about how to keep pushing for reform. These conversations weren't always serious. There were plenty of laughs too, often at the expense of their earlier encounter. "Do you remember when I laughed uncontrollably on live TV?" Rachel joked during one such meeting. "I still can't believe that happened," Karoline grinned, stirring her coffee. "Honestly, it's probably the reason half the country watched. If you hadn't cracked up, would anyone have cared?" They both burst out laughing, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. Looking back, neither of them could deny that moment of vulnerability had humanized them in ways neither anticipated. People connected with authenticity, and that night, they'd shown theirs without meaning to. As time went on, their collaboration deepened. Together, they launched a joint initiative called Truth Unfiltered, aimed at educating the public about media literacy and civic engagement. Through podcasts, webinars, and community events, they worked to demystify how information is gathered, shared, and manipulated. The response was overwhelming. Thousands signed up for workshops, eager to understand how they could navigate a world saturated with misinformation. But the road wasn't always smooth. Critics still questioned Karoline's methods, accusing her of undermining trust by recording private conversations. Others argued that Rachel's association with Karoline somehow compromised her journalistic integrity. Both women acknowledged the criticism. They didn't agree with all of it, but they respected the importance of debate. After all, progress rarely came without pushback. Still, the positives outweighed the negatives. Grassroots movements inspired by Karoline's revelations gained traction, leading to legislative changes in several states. Campaign finance laws were tightened, lobbying regulations were reviewed, and some news organizations implemented stricter ethical guidelines. None of these victories solved every problem, but they proved that small actions could lead to big results. For Rachel, the experience taught her humility and resilience. She realized that seeking truth wasn't about being perfect. It was about staying curious, open-minded, and willing to adapt. For Karoline, it reinforced her belief that courage was contagious. When one person stood up, others followed suit. Together, they showed that accountability wasn't a solo endeavor. It required collective effort. On the anniversary of the infamous interview, Rachel invited Karoline back onto her show, not to relive the past, but to celebrate how far they'd come. Sitting across from each other in the familiar studio setting, they reflected on the journey. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't walked into this studio with those recordings? Rachel asked, leaning forward slightly. Karoline thought for a moment before answering. All the time, but honestly, I don't regret it. Even knowing everything that came after, the backlash, the threats, I'd do it again, because silence doesn't fix anything. Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. And I'm glad you did. Not just because it changed my perspective, but because it reminded me why I got into this business in the first place. The audience, watching at home, felt the sincerity in their words. This wasn't just another TV segment. It was a testament to growth, resilience, and the power of truth. As the episode wrapped up, Rachel turned to the camera and said, "We may not have all the answers, but we're committed to asking the right questions. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough." When the cameras stopped rolling, Karoline and Rachel lingered in the studio, chatting quietly about future plans. Neither knew exactly where the path ahead would take them, but they were okay with uncertainty. They'd learned that progress wasn't linear. It was messy, unpredictable, and often uncomfortable, but it was also worth it. As they walked out together, side by side, they shared a glance filled with quiet understanding. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them head-on, not alone, but together. In a world desperate for honesty and hope, their partnership stood as proof that even the most unlikely alliances could spark meaningful change. Years passed, and the story of that fateful interview became more than just a memory. It became a legend. For many, it was a turning point in how they viewed power, accountability, and the role of individuals in shaping society. What had started as a single moment on live television grew into a movement that inspired countless others to question authority, demand transparency, and take action in their own communities. Karoline's influence only deepened with time. Her advocacy work expanded beyond national borders, earning her recognition as a global voice for reform. She traveled extensively, meeting activists, lawmakers, and everyday citizens who were fighting similar battles in their own countries. Along the way, she learned that corruption and secrecy weren't unique to any one place. They were universal, challenges that required universal solutions. One of her proudest achievements came when an international coalition adopted her organization's framework for promoting transparency in government contracting. It wasn't perfect, but it marked a significant step toward ensuring public funds were used responsibly. Karoline often joked that she never imagined herself becoming the policy nerd everyone talks about at boring conferences, but she couldn't deny the impact her efforts were having. Back in the U.S., Rachel continued to evolve as a journalist and storyteller. Her show remained a staple of late-night television, but its focus shifted even further toward solutions-oriented reporting. Instead of simply highlighting problems, each episode now explored potential fixes, whether it was grassroots campaigns tackling voter suppression or tech startups developing tools to combat misinformation. Viewers appreciated the shift. They tuned in not just to stay informed, but to feel empowered. Rachel also ventured into new territory, hosting a documentary series that took her across the country to meet people working to improve their communities. From small-town mayors reviving local economies to teachers creating innovative programs in underfunded schools, the stories showcased resilience and ingenuity. The series won critical acclaim, cementing Rachel's reputation as someone who could balance hard-hitting journalism with heartfelt storytelling. Despite their busy lives, Karoline and Rachel stayed connected, checking in regularly via phone, calls, or texts. Their friendship had grown stronger over the years, built on shared values and mutual respect. They celebrated milestones together, Karoline's wedding, Rachel's milestone anniversary in broadcasting, and leaned on each other during tough times. When Karoline faced renewed criticism from opponents trying to discredit her work, Rachel was the first to call and offer support. And when Rachel struggled with burnout after decades in the spotlight, Karoline reminded her why her voice mattered. Their collaboration extended beyond personal projects. Truth Unfiltered, the initiative they'd launched together, flourished into a nationwide network of workshops and resources. Thousands of participants, from high school students learning about media literacy to retirees eager to stay engaged in civic life, credited the program with giving them the tools to navigate an increasingly complex world. Together, Karoline and Rachel proved that progress wasn't just about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about planting seeds and watching them grow. But perhaps the most profound legacy of their partnership was the ripple effect it created. Inspired by their example, ordinary people began stepping up to hold power accountable. A teacher in Ohio started a petition demanding greater transparency in school funding. A factory worker in Michigan organized his co-workers to advocate for safer working conditions. A college student in California developed an app to track political campaign contributions. None of these efforts made headlines, but collectively they represented a groundswell of change. For both women, this was the ultimate reward. They hadn't set out to be heroes or icons. They'd simply wanted to make a difference. Seeing others follow in their footsteps reinforced their belief that real change came from the ground up, not the top down. On a crisp autumn evening, several years after their initial encounter, Karoline and Rachel found themselves back in the same TV studio, where it all began. This time, however, the atmosphere was warm and celebratory. They were there to mark the anniversary of Truth Unfiltered's launch, surrounded by supporters, volunteers, and fellow advocates. As they stood side by side on stage, the crowd erupted in applause. "Look at this room," Rachel said, gesturing to the diverse group of people gathered. "This is what happens when we refuse to stay silent. This is what happens when we choose courage over comfort." Karoline smiled, adding, "And this is proof that no one has to do it alone. Change is messy, imperfect, and sometimes downright exhausting, but it's always possible when we work together." The audience cheered, moved by their words. For many in attendance, the evening felt like a full-circle moment, a reminder of how far they'd come and how much farther they could go. As the event wrapped up, Karoline and Rachel lingered backstage, reflecting on the journey. "Do you ever wonder if we'll look back on all this someday and laugh?" Karoline asked, her tone light but curious. Rachel chuckled softly. "Probably. But I think we'll also feel proud, not because we changed the world overnight, but because we helped nudge it in the right direction." They shared a knowing smile, aware that their story wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been inspired to speak up, stand tall, and fight for a better future. In a world often clouded by cynicism, their partnership served as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, truth and determination could still prevail. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights twinkling around them, neither woman knew exactly what lay ahead. But they didn't need to. They had already proven that the hardest truths could lead to the brightest outcomes, and that was enough to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The years rolled on, and the legacy of that unforgettable interview continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways neither Karoline nor Rachel could have imagined. What had started as a single act of courage, a young woman walking into a TV studio with secret recordings, had grown into something much bigger. It wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about inspiring people to believe they had the power to challenge injustice, no matter how daunting it seemed. Karoline's advocacy work reached new heights, but her greatest impact came not from grand gestures, but from small everyday moments. She spent countless hours mentoring others, young activists eager to make their voices heard, seasoned organizers looking for fresh ideas, even skeptics who doubted change was possible. Her message was always the same. You don't have to be perfect to make a difference. You just have to start. One of her most memorable experiences came during a trip to a small town in the Midwest. A group of high school students had invited her to speak at their school after reading her memoir for a class project. When she arrived, she expected polite applause and a few polite questions. Instead, she found herself surrounded by teenagers, brimming with energy and ideas. One student stood up and said, "Your story made me realize I don't have to wait until I'm older to do something important. So we started a project to clean up our local park. It's been neglected for years, and now it's finally getting attention." Karoline left that day feeling renewed. These kids weren't waiting for permission or validation. They were taking action right where they were. And while cleaning up a park might seem small compared to national scandals, it mattered deeply to those students and their community. That realization stayed with her, reinforcing her belief that every effort counted, no matter how modest it appeared. Meanwhile, Rachel's influence expanded beyond television screens. Her documentary series sparked conversations across living rooms, classrooms, and community centers nationwide. Viewers wrote letters thanking her for shining a light on stories they'd never heard before, stories of resilience, creativity, and hope. One viewer, a retired teacher from Texas, sent a handwritten note saying, "Your show reminded me that there are still good people doing good work in this world. It inspired me to volunteer at my local library and help kids learn to read." Rachel kept that letter pinned to her office wall, a reminder of why she did what she did. Over time, she began focusing more on amplifying grassroots efforts, giving a platform to unsung heroes making a difference in quiet, steady ways. Whether it was a farmer using sustainable practices to combat climate change or a barber offering free haircuts to homeless veterans, these stories resonated deeply with audiences hungry for positivity amid chaos. But perhaps the most remarkable development was how Karoline and Rachel's partnership inspired others to collaborate. People began reaching out to them, asking how they could replicate their model of teamwork in their own communities. A pair of journalists in Chicago launched a joint investigation into housing discrimination, crediting Karoline and Rachel for showing them the value of working together, despite differing backgrounds. In New York, a tech entrepreneur partnered with a nonprofit leader to create an app connecting underserved families with affordable childcare options. Each collaboration carried echoes of the bond between Karoline and Rachel, a shared commitment to finding common ground and driving change. Of course, challenges remained. Critics still questioned whether secret recordings were ethical, and some accused Karoline of prioritizing drama over dialogue. Others dismissed Rachel's shift toward solutions-oriented reporting as naive or overly optimistic. Both women acknowledged the criticism, not because they agreed with it, but because they understood the importance of listening to opposing views. Progress rarely came without resistance, and they were determined to stay grounded in humility and integrity. Despite the obstacles, their friendship only grew stronger. They celebrated victories big and small, from legislative wins to personal milestones. When Karoline gave birth to her first child, Rachel flew across the country to meet the newborn, bringing along a stack of classic novels she insisted would shape the baby's worldview. "Start them early," she joked. And when Rachel faced health issues later in life, Karoline was there, organizing a team of friends to ensure she had support during recovery. Their bond became a source of inspiration for many. At speaking engagements, people often asked how two individuals from such different worlds had formed such a deep connection. Karoline usually responded with a laugh, saying, "We didn't exactly hit it off at first, but sometimes the best relationships come from challenging each other." Rachel would nod, adding, "And remembering that we're all human. We mess up, we grow, and we keep moving forward." As decades passed, the cultural landscape shifted dramatically. Technology advanced, political landscapes transformed, and societal norms evolved. Yet the lessons from that explosive interview endured. Transparency, accountability, and courage remained timeless values, guiding generations of changemakers. Textbooks included mentions of the event, framing it as a pivotal moment in modern history. Documentaries explored its impact, interviewing everyone from academics to everyday citizens whose lives had been touched. For Karoline and Rachel, the ultimate measure of success wasn't fame or accolades. It was seeing their vision take root in the hearts and minds of others. They knew they hadn't solved every problem, nor had they erased the flaws in systems plagued by greed and secrecy. But they had planted seeds of hope, nurturing them with persistence and compassion. On a quiet evening years later, they sat together on Rachel's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was filled with the sounds of crickets chirping and distant laughter from neighbors. Neither spoke for a long moment, content to simply sit in companionable silence. "You know," Rachel finally said, breaking the quiet, "I used to think the truth alone could save us. Now I realize it's not just about uncovering it, it's about what we do with it." Karoline nodded, sipping her tea. "And it's about who we become in the process. All those little choices add up, don't they?" They exchanged a smile, knowing their journey wasn't defined by one night on live TV, but by the countless moments since then when they chose to keep going, keep learning, and keep believing in the possibility of a better tomorrow. As darkness settled over the horizon, the two women lingered on the porch, reflecting on all they'd accomplished, and all that still lay ahead. Their story wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to anyone brave enough to stand up, speak out, and fight for justice. And in that shared legacy, they found peace, purpose, and endless potential.